De fleste i rommet her er født i Norge, eller oppvokst i Norge. I bydelen her så hørte dere om at det er ganske mange som er født i et annet land, eller i det minste har familie som kommer fra andre land. Årsakene til at de har kommet hit er ganske forskjellige, men ingen har en historie som er lik en annen. En av dem som har bodd her på Gulset, men flyttet herfra, helt bort til Åfoss, ble innvandrer på Åfoss. Han skal vi møte nå. Han er fra Nord-Nigeria, og følger man med i nyheter så vet man at det er ikke den fredeligste plassen på jord. Med mye rasisme, mye motsetninger, mye uro. Nord-Nigeria. Så har han bodd i Kanada, han har bodd i Sveits og Sør-Afrika, og han forsker nå på migrasjon og inkludering til å ta doktorgrad ved et universitet i Nederland. I sommer så skulle han ha forelest på en verdenskongress i Rio de Janeiro. Den ble ikke gjennomført på grunn av det vi kjenner til. Men nå er han her, og nå skal du ta godt imot Gabriel Stephen. Vær god.
Introduksjon. Ja, jeg må bare beklage. Dette foredrag skal foregå på engelsk, og det er fordi det er mitt fagspråk. Jeg forstår litt norsk, som du hører, men jeg tror kanskje det er best at jeg får fram mine tanker på engelsk, så jeg kjører på. Yes, so my theme is everyday inclusion, but what I have done is to take out the inclusion and call racism. Everyday racism in Grenland. As you've heard, I'm a product of international migration. I'm from Nigeria. I've lived in South Africa, Switzerland, Canada, and now Norway the last 9 years. My wife is white, and we have 2 blended kids, but we also have a foster son that is Asian. So if you've ever wondered what the United Nations looks like, you just need to come to my house. So we live every day like the United Nations, and we see the benefits and the challenges that accompanies such a lifestyle and such an awareness of being multicultural. But today I'm going to talk about everyday racism in Grenland. And I want to start by talking about the main theme, which is, or the main begrep is the word in Norwegian that comes first, which is what is racism? So racism is defined as prejudice, discrimination, antagonism by an individual, community, or institution against a person or people on the basis of their membership of a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is minority or marginalized. One could also say that racism is the belief that different races possess distinctive characteristics, abilities, or qualities so as to distinguish them as either inferior or superior to one another. Elizabeth Kolata in her book, The Roots of Racism, isolates 2 important aspects about human interaction that I would like us to take a closer look at. The first is that racism is an expression of our evolved capacity to live and work together in groups, also known as, tribal mentality. The very human tendency to define with us versus them mentality lies in the very core of racial discrimination. Racism is therefore a type of group identification, a tribal way of thinking, that is categorized on the basis of race and ethnicity. The second point Kolata wants us to look at is the correlation between powers, or power dynamic, which is power presents itself in the form of acceptance or privileges, or rather access to resources. So in this tribal way of thinking, there is an in-group and there is an out-group. And each group is ascribed with certain power and opportunities. The in-group, which is often the normative, is experiences, whether it's love or acceptance or a lot of goodwill, and often controls the resources that there is in the given space. The out-group, on the other hand, is distinguished by a dislike from the in-group, and have often little, or sometimes no access whatsoever to resources. So after taking a look at what racism is, let's look at what everyday racism looks like. The Dutch sociologist Philomena Esser defines this idea as the normal practices, hence the word everyday, which permeate society and disadvantage ethnic minorities. Such practices infiltrate society or organization, and become seen as the normal by the members of this society or organization. So the use of everyday, when we talk about everyday racism, is a way to normalize or diffuse the impact of implicit racial discrimination experiences. This is, of course, in contrast to what we call institutional racism, which is often, the horrific experience of, people looking for jobs. I think we've heard a lot of that in Norway. People who are qualified and have the right experiences, but because they have a different skin color, they speak the language not completely well, or have a different last name or belong to different religions, often are met with no response from places of work that they have sought to find employment. That is institutional racism. Institutional racism, even in Shan, for example, not too long ago, a taxi driver by the name Shapwan Ali told the story of him being at his workplace as a taxi driver, giving his services to clients, but often met with racist comments that just, he said, almost traumatized his everyday life. That is institutional racism. But I want us to look at one that is a bit more implicit, a bit more undertone, where it is acceptable to think that certain groups and certain ethnicities belong to certain kinds of jobs. Or we think that if you see someone like me walking into NAB, that this person is most likely going to get social help. People almost don't think twice that maybe perhaps this person is working for the government to give the social help to people that they need. This implicit racism lies in the very core of our Norwegian society, and we often do not even think twice about it. So, racism does not exist in a vacuum. Is that correct? I'm a guy that likes responses, so don't just sit down and go, yeah. Racism does not exist in a vacuum. It needs a social context, an everyday reality. That's why it's called everyday racism. It needs a location for it to become active. In our case, this is Grenland, Skien, Porsgrunn, Bamble, and the regions around. Did you know that it's about 15 to 25% of the general population in this region that identify themselves as migrants? Did you know that? Of course, if you live in Gulset, that is your everyday reality. But around this region, about 15 to 20% of people look a bit like me, or about thereabout. Heinz Haas, Mark Miller, and Stephen Castle, these are great names when you talk about migration research, have talked about, in their discourse of racism, how the whole idea of belonging. They say basically that racism indicates that there is a certain group that belongs and a certain group that does not belong. William Schenkel, a Dutch sociologist, says that every culture has markers of identity that are founded on sociological and cultural assumptions of what belongs and what does not belong. In this case, the image of a nation. In our case in Grenland, to belong means to be white and preferably Norwegian. But if you want to push it, you could be white, Scandinavian, or from Western Europe. So people like me meet what I call norskhet. We meet the Norwegianness, and we feel immediately that we are not welcome. We feel immediately that the measure, the canon measure of our belonging is based on external features that we do not have any power over. So everyday racism or hardcore racism, regardless of what this racism type is a reminder that people of color are considered to not belong in places like Norway, but also in our region, Grenland. I would like, just a quick second, and another thing that I think is also very important for us to get is that the idea of a society is one that will often presuppose that it is a whole, although we define it in very abstract ways. So when something is a whole, when something new comes in, it cannot be fit together. Migrants are often seen and viewed as misfits. Did you know that? Because if society is whole, when people like me show up, then there's no place for us. And often we go around our everyday lives without thinking twice of the implication of belonging in societies. And I have to say, there's no one that talks about mangfold I've lived in many countries. I've lived in Canada, for example, that's very multicultural. But boy, will I say that Norway speaks a lot about diversity. It speaks about diversity as if this is the very existence, reality that we have. But the reality that I have seen is that, you know, society is already a whole and everyone else is lying outside. Two stories I'd like to share briefly to highlight this thesis of belonging and identification that I see lacks in Norway. The first story is about a family who moved into this middle-class community in Grenland. And as everyone does, you know, when you move to a new place, you go to say hello to your neighbors. And upon saying hello to the neighbor then mentioned, he said, yeah, you know, by the way, I thought the person that was outside fixing this house was the one that bought the house. Now, this was a white carpenter that this family had hired to fix the house for them. And this person said, you know what, now, actually, we were the ones that bought this house. Now, this family is middle class, you know, educated and has an income that allowed them to move to a middle class Norwegian neighborhood. And then this neighbor looked to them and said to them, you know, I think people in the neighborhood are looking out the window and thinking, what is this black person doing here? This is implicit racism, my friends. This neighbor did not intentionally meant to be racist, but their thought process had racial implications. Another story I'd like to share, I see my time is going, is about a woman who's got a mother of two in Skien, who was educated in the area of history and humanities. And this person grew up in Norway, so that she speaks Norwegian fluently and understands the cultural context of Norway. Yet, being a part of an organization, she was always reminded, when issues on cultures emerge, she was reminded that she was not Norwegian enough. She was told, you know, you cannot understand this because you do not come from Norway. Now, I don't think those people meant that being Norwegian, or these people meant to be racist in their utterances. But there's a subconscious reality that has informed them that people that look different from them do not have the intellectual capacity to grasp what it means to be Norwegian. Oh, another thesis that I have is that maybe being Norwegian is not about being knowledgeable in the language and the culture, but it's about having origins from Norway, or what we call slektskap, according to Marianne Gulset. But I have to say that there are criterion of belonging that, you know, from these stories that, you know, excludes, that I would like to see a correction to. And first and foremost, I want to say, I would like us to stop using the buzzword mangfold, or diversity, until when we begin to actually want to live it out. Because often the buzzword of mangfold or diversity in English is what we use to excuse not living diversity out. So, this leads me to ask the question, is diversity an asset or liability? And as I said, in Grenland, many people talk about this thing, you know, diversity, but in my own experiences of living in this part of the country for 8-9 years, you know, instead of diversity to be an asset, diversity is often viewed in the long run as liability. So I think the utterances, as I said, of politicians and individuals often indicates a vision of where we want to go to, or the place we want to be. But we cannot get to the place that diversity is intrinsically desirable without us really taking along those that can teach us diversity. I claim that ethnic Norwegians cannot teach migrants diversity. Why? Because they do not know what it means to be the other. For us to learn diversity, we have to bring along all the voices that would teach us what it means to be diverse and what it means to embrace that. So to reduce racism, it will require us to both fight institutional racism, but also to fight everyday racism. Because since we live in a pseudo-capitalist society, right, we need to actually make diversity desirable by underlying the fact that diversity actually has benefits for our society. That it can actually make us richer. It can make us better. There is positive consequences to diversity. And this is said in Stephen Haug's work. He says a feeling of belonging has the strongest relationship to engagement. This means that belonging has a high correlation to outcomes like productivity and retention. When you increase belonging, you increase productivity and you increase retention. Retention in the sense that people will not want to leave where they live already. They want to remain and continue to contribute. belonging, the indicator of belonging is participation. And we've heard it already that many parents are not participating in creating a community. It's perhaps because they do not have a strong sense of belonging. And this is very, very sad. So how do we do that? How do we increase belonging? I would like to suggest that we need to learn to be reflexive. What is reflexivity? Reflexivity is an attempt to grasp in full substance what science overlooked while being possessed by a taken for granted paradigm, which draws, which is reflexivity, attention not only to what we produce and perform on center stage, like laws and vedtekter that we have in the communes, but also what is left aside, marginalized, backstage, things that we overlook. We need to be reflexive. We need to look ourselves in the mirror and say, what are my blind sides? What is it I do not see in relations to racism or inclusion or belonging in Grenland? And when we begin to do that, we learn to ask the right questions. We learn to converse with people who are different. We learn to share our lives together, which will then eventually lead to my next point. That will lead to community. The more doors into the community, the more likely you are to create a healthy community that offers a sense of belonging and identity, says David Mail in 2016. And so, here's my point. For us to create an inclusive community in Grenland, we need to fight the things that are dividing us. We need to fight racism. Not only institutional racism, we need to fight implicit racism. We need to wake up and say, hey, I know you're different and your differences sometimes challenges me, but can we create common platforms where we could talk together, we could learn together, and by so doing, we could increase a sense of belonging that brings about a wealth in experience for both you and me. So, if you have forgotten, and my time is running out, if you've forgotten anything I've said right now, I want to tell you, racism, everyday racism exists. And the only way we could deal with everyday racism is by trying to figure out where we are at, by talking to each other, learning reflexivity, talking about the things that separate us, and finding ways to make those same things, create a sense of inclusion. We need to learn to listen. We need to learn to talk to each other. We need to create common platforms like what Gulset Center has done, so that we would talk in conversation to encourage each other to say that I need you and you need me for this place to be rich and to be a place for our children, for the common good of all humanities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have you here. When the conference in Rio de Janeiro couldn't be real, Gulsetkonferansen is real, international. Thank you. Applaus. Så er jeg utrolig takknemlig, Gabriel, for vennskap, for fellesskap, for at vi får snakke om dette her når vi går tur. Når vi går tur til Fantkjerringkollen, ellers sitter det ikke kaffe. Så nå skal vi få høre mer fra Gabriel, både i dag og dagene fremover.